delighted to have you here, and I'm really delighted to be able to introduce my friend and colleague Sean Lawson, who is a professor at the Communication Department at the University of Utah, and does really interesting work on science, technology, and national security. He's done work on U.S. military thought and the use of social media in the military, and on public policy debates around cyber security, which is what he's going to be focused on today. And he's working on a book project that this talk comes out of. He's also involved with NATO, an annual conference that he's just come back from, where he's on the program committee related to this, and editor of a book series with Routledge on conflict, security, and technology, and did his PhD in science and technology studies at Rensselaer Polytechnical Institute and an MA in Arab Studies at Georgetown University. With no further ado, delighted to introduce Dr. Sean Lawson.
All right, thanks, Jackie. Okay, well, thank you for that introduction. I'm very honored to be here today. Actually, my dad worked for the lab for a little over 25 years and recently retired, just a few years ago, 4 years ago now. And luckily, Sandra was able to get him a visitor badge so that he could come and see the talk today as well. And I remember visiting the lab as a kid, and it was always a place of great mystery and wonder because it was where Dad works, and you can't go there, right? But I did get to visit a few times for open houses, and one time actually even for a take your son or daughter to work day, and was amazed to get to go and see the Nova Laser, and even on one occasion got to go back into Superblock where Dad worked, which was a very rare treat, and was just amazed that everything was sort of like something out of Star Trek. And Brad was telling me at the beginning that the National Ignition Facility is the basis for where they filmed the engine room on the recent Star Trek movie. So it's not just like out of Star Trek, it really is out of Star Trek. So it blew my mind, and so it's very, it's an honor to come back here, and but it also, it always led us to give Dad a hard time. We'd say, how is it you can work at the lab, but you can't manage to run the VCR? But that's all right. I can't run my electronics most of the time anyway, as you see from the drama that we had getting the PowerPoint set up. So in any case, I'm very honored to be here, and I'm glad you were able to get a pass for him to be able to come and watch as well. And so thank you to Jackie and to the center for having me. Okay, everything is working. So as Jackie mentioned, I am associate professor at the University of Utah in the Department of Communication. So that means I'm coming to you today from node number 4 on the original internet, the ARPANET. University of Utah was node 4 on the original ARPANET. But of course, Utah and the Salt Lake area is also the home of the new NSA data center. So as I like to say, I'm coming to you today from both the beginning and the end of the internet. And so today I want to talk a little about the research that I've been doing over the past 10 years or so at this point on the intersections of information and communication technologies with international conflict. And specifically, I want to talk about my work that's looked at the role of what I call cyber doom rhetoric in the U.S. public policy debate about cybersecurity and conflict. So to do that, I'll begin by defining what I mean by cyber doom rhetoric, as well as providing a brief overview of some of the most common variations in the use of doom rhetoric in the public debate about cybersecurity. Part of what we will see is that though cyber doom rhetoric is quite common in the U.S. public policy debate, few folks actually, I think, really believe that it's an accurate representation of the real cyber threats that we face. So that raises the question then of why such rhetoric persists, right? If most people, if you push them, admit, yeah, doom scenarios are really not what the real threat is from cyber, then why is it that this rhetoric is so persistent in our public policy debate about it? And my answer will be that cyber doom rhetoric is precisely that. It's rhetoric, which means that it's a tool of persuasion. And the use of these kinds of scenarios and this kind of rhetoric is particularly meant as an appeal to fear, meant to call attention and motivate action. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a minute. Next, I'll talk about and outline some of the potential problems that I see with the prominence of cyber doom rhetoric in our debate about what to do about cybersecurity and characterizing the challenges that we face. And finally, I'll point just quickly to some possible alternative ways of thinking, speaking, and framing cybersecurity threats that I think might provide a way forward that could help us to avoid some of the pitfalls of cyber doom rhetoric. Okay, so what do I mean when I talk about cyber doom rhetoric, and what are the sort of characteristics of that rhetoric? So cyber doom refers to the tendency of some in our debates about cyber conflict to warn of ever-impending doom scenarios in which cyber attacks do things like crash power grids, crash transportation systems, financial networks, and more, often all at the same time. The ultimate impacts in these kinds of stories, and I'm sure a lot of you have heard these kinds of stories either in the media or from politicians or others. The ultimate impacts in these kinds of stories and scenarios is usually the collapse or paralysis of entire societies, economies, what I like to call the Lord of the Flies impact, right? So in these stories, oftentimes it's not just that a massive cyber attack in the future takes down the power grid or takes down the financial system or both or some combination of systems, but usually also that these kinds of scenarios then predict that we're all just going to fall apart and we're going to be beating each other in the streets. The bonds of society are going to completely break as soon as your microwave doesn't work anymore or something. Traffic in such warnings is quite common, especially among officials and politicians. Perhaps most infamous in this regard is Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta's 2012 warning and description about an impending cyber Pearl Harbor. Of course, he's not the only one to have made such warnings, however. The image on the slide here is an example from popular media. It was an image that graced the cover of The Economist magazine a few years ago now and provides a sort of visual representation of cyber doom rhetoric. In this case, a digital pixelated mushroom cloud, which is, I guess, appropriate for being at the lab, right? So, of course, the most common form that cyber doom rhetoric takes is the use of hypothetical scenarios, right? So these involve the use of fictional stories in which cyber attacks lead to mass destruction or disruption, panic, paralysis, chaos, collapse, and crippling of society are dominant themes here, right? In fact, I've set up several Google News alerts that search for the terms that show up quite often, right, in this debate. And so I have one that is, combination of panic or paralysis or paralyzed or chaos or chaotic or collapse or, crippled, crippling, et cetera, and cyber, because those adjectives get used so often to talk about the potential future of a cyber attack. But other tactics also get used to promote fear of impending cyber doom beyond just the use of just a sort of plain vanilla hypothetical scenario. So one of those is historical analogies and metaphors. So I mentioned a second ago cyber Pearl Harbor, which is really the most common by far of all of the analogies and metaphors that get used to try to get people to think about cybersecurity and take it more seriously and make a sort of prediction of what could potentially happen in the future. But we also see analogies and metaphors to natural disasters like Hurricane Katrina. So I've seen people say we're going to have a cyber Katrina. We're going to have a cyber 9/11. We are currently in a cyber Cold War. Analogies and metaphors to weapons of mass destruction, primarily nuclear weapons. All of these imply consequences, of course, on par with the most destructive surprise attacks, the most destructive weapons and natural disasters that the world has witnessed, right? But they also hold out, in some cases, the promise of a new strategic weapon that perhaps we could use on others. Beyond scenarios and analogies and metaphors, we see the use of conflation to sort of bump up the level of cyber threat to try to get people's attention. And so this involves conflating very different kinds of cyber threats into one monolithic, undifferentiated threat. In fact, I would say even the use of the phrase, the cyber threat, is an example of conflation. Because in fact, we face a lot of different cyber threats. There's crime, there's espionage, There's threats to critical infrastructure, potentially military attack. There's subterfuge and the use of propaganda and disinformation. And some people might these days even put fake news into the cyber category, although that's debatable in and of itself, exactly where the boundaries of cyber threat begin and end. But even wherever we draw the boundaries inside of there's a lot of different kinds of threats. And so crime and espionage are very common, but maybe not particularly fear-inducing when you're trying to make a case and get people to wake up and pay more attention. Military attacks or cyber attacks against critical infrastructure are a lot scarier sounding, right? But to this point anyway have been exceedingly rare, right? So rhetorically speaking, creating one sort of monolithic, undifferentiated cyber threat that just lumps all of this into one big threat is potentially more persuasive, right? It potentially ups the fear factor and it ups the saliency factor because it implies that everyone everywhere is potentially a victim of the cyber threat, even though that huge threat includes everything from online identity theft all the way up to, the electrical grid going down, which is a huge range of things. The next tactic that I identify is what I call appropriation or piggybacking. So this is where someone will try to increase fear of potential cyber attacks in the future by appropriating or piggybacking off of the fear created by non-cyber events in an effort to promote fear of future cyber attacks or future cyber doom. So, for example, the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995 was actually a major focusing event for U.S. policymakers to focus their attention on cyber war. So if we think back to the President's Critical Infrastructure Commission, that was put into place after the 1995 Oklahoma City attacks. A lot of the work of that commission got taken over by people who were concerned with possible cyber attacks in the future. And this is, even though the 1995 attack in Oklahoma City really was not a cyber attack, it really didn't have anything to do with cyber at all. Of course, some of these categories overlap one another, right? So cyber Pearl Harbor, cyber 9/11, et cetera. In addition to being analogies and metaphors, they work through the mechanism of appropriation or piggybacking. In this case, piggybacking off of or appropriating the fear and anxiety induced by thinking about events like 9/11 or Pearl Harbor and the imagery that induces in us, and then using that to say, if you're worried about that, then think about this, right? Think about this thing over here. Similarly, after Superstorm Sandy, DHS Secretary Janet Napolitano used that storm to warn publicly about the potential future impacts of cyber attacks. The editor of Foreign Policy magazine, David Rothkopf, used the Fukushima disaster to warn about cyber attacks, right? Essentially, if you think that's bad, then just wait for cyber attacks, okay? Another tactic that gets used in cyber doom rhetoric is just straight up exaggeration, right? Which involves events that really are cyber in some way, but relies on exaggerating the effects of those events to try to get people to take cyber more seriously. So an example here is we can think back to a few years ago, 2011, when Amit Yoran, who was the former cybersecurity head of cybersecurity at the Department of Homeland Security, said that a series of data breaches that had happened in the year prior to his statement constitute in and of themselves a cyber 9/11. That cyber 9/11 had actually already happened, right? Of course, nobody was killed in this. Nothing was destroyed. Nothing collapsed. There's no damage in that kind of way. Speaker of the Estonian Parliament said in 2007 that the cyber attacks, the denial of service attacks that hit that country in April and May of 2007, she likened them to the equivalent of a nuclear attack and said, when I see a cyber attack and I see a nuclear attack, they look the same to me of what just happened in my country, which is ridiculous, right? Not even anyone was remotely killed or even hurt in that cyber attack. So these are clear examples of exaggeration. So the OPM hack, several lawmakers called the OPM hack our cyber 9/11. The director of the National Intelligence Agency called the hack of Sony a couple of years ago the fulfillment of cyber Pearl Harbor. Okay, so there's a lot of examples of these. It's pretty common for something happens and then somebody says either if you think this was bad, then just wait, we're going to have Cyber Pearl Harbor, Cyber 9/11. Or sometimes they will say, this was Cyber 9/11, or this was Cyber Pearl Harbor. Two different, slightly related tactics to try to scare people and get their attention. The other is the use of counterfactuals. So this occurs when a real cyber event is used to warn about what could have but didn't, but might yet still occur, right? So this is essentially the it could have been worse story, right? So recently, Fred Kaplan wrote a book called Dark Territory, and one theme that you will see if you read that book is that early cyber incidents became signal or focusing events not for the damage that they actually caused themselves, what they actually did, but for the damage that they might have done or might do in the future. Okay? So a lot of times when an event happens, people are concerned about it, not necessarily for what it really did, but for what it might signal about what could happen but didn't. The most recent, I think, best example of this in a speech to the RSA conference, I think it was last year, the director of National Security Agency, Rogers, used the hack of the Ukrainian power grid, for example, to warn of the inevitability of worse attacks in the future. I would say that might also fall in the category of exaggeration a little bit, because if you actually go and look at that particular attack, sure, it was an attack where a cyber attack took down a power grid for maybe up to 6 hours. It kind of depends on which report you read about it. But at most, it looks like it affected maybe 0.5% of the total population of the country for maybe up to 6 hours, right? And doesn't seem to have had a lot of impact on the overall conflict between the parties there, okay? So again, it's mainly used rhetorically as a way of saying, if this happened, something worse could happen, and calling our attention not to what really happened in the particular instance, but to get us imagining and thinking about what might happen in the future. And finally, the last sort of category that I've identified and am sort of using to classify when I'm reading through articles and speeches and statements and government reports and all sorts of different materials, and classify the different ways that cyber doom rhetoric is used, is projection or mirror imaging. So this involves attributing to others the very actions undertaken by ourselves or actions or capabilities that we wish to have or use, right? So in some cases, this involves pointing to specific incidents or types of malicious cyber activities that the United States has already perpetrated itself and using those very incidents as evidence of the threat that others supposedly pose to us. So the biggest example in this regard is Stuxnet, right, which is the joint US-Israeli cyber attack on the Iranian nuclear program. It has been used by officials, commentators, and others as evidence of the cyber threat that we face, right? So statements like, oh, we really face a big threat of cyber attack that could cripple critical infrastructure. Look what happened in Stuxnet. It's like, wait, we did that. How is us doing something to somebody else necessarily evidence of a threat to us? It might be, but it's problematic. Similarly, we know from Fred Kaplan's book and other works that the U.S. has been engaged in hacking of foreign communication networks for espionage and attack purposes all the way back to the 1980s. And to enable that, it has in some cases either caused or overlooked critical security flaws in IT systems. These flaws are then used sometimes as evidence of the threat that we face in cybersecurity. So a situation that we in part helped to create or enable is then used in some cases by officials or others to say, see, look how big the cybersecurity threat is. So the example du jour is, right, the ransomware attack that a lot of us have been paying attention to that, part of the controversy around that is it was partly enabled by vulnerabilities that the NSA had found and sat on and did not tell Microsoft in time for those vulnerabilities to be patched, and now those are being used to spread a massive malware attack around the world. Okay, so the so-called Cyber Pearl Harbor is one of the best sort of stand-ins for cyber doom rhetoric as a whole, more broadly. And as an historical analogy, it's one of the most prominent and recurring examples of cyber doom rhetoric in US public policy discourse about cybersecurity. So one of my recent projects actually examined the Cyber Pearl Harbor analogy in detail and its use in statements by officials and then also in the news media. So my colleague at Utah and I Professor Michael Middleton, used or examined the use of Cyber Pearl Harbor in these instances from 1991 to 2016, so a 25-year period, as a way of sort of a proxy for kind of looking at cyber doom rhetoric more broadly. In part because it's easy to target Cyber Pearl Harbor. You can search for it by name and find all of the examples of it being said, right? Whereas a lot of these other kinds of variations on cyber doom rhetoric are hard to pinpoint and go out and purposely find them. Instead, you have to be reading a lot of material and then see the pattern, but they're harder to like sort of search for deliberately. But Cyber Pearl Harbor, you can go and look for it, right? You can find examples of it. And so what we wanted to do is see how often does this occur, who's most often using this kind of rhetoric, who's using the Cyber Pearl Harbor, what are they attempting to accomplish with it, et cetera. And so I'll just go through a few of the points that we found in doing that study. And I put a quote here on the slide from John Markoff from the New York Times. It's just one of many, many examples of the use of Cyber Pearl Harbor in news media, but it kind of encapsulates what is often found in the use of doom scenarios more generally, and Cyber Pearl Harbor in particular, which involves lots of systems going down and paralysis of society, right? So that there's, it's not just that it was sudden or it was unexpected or it caught us by surprise. No, it's usually Cyber Pearl Harbor and doom scenarios are meant to evoke this kind of a vision. Lots of systems, chaos, paralysis. That's usually what it sort of invokes. So, like cyber doom more generally, in its most common usage, the Cyber Pearl Harbor analogy or metaphor involves not just large-scale computer network attacks, but attacks that lead to social or economic paralysis and chaos. And it's often these secondary or tertiary effects that we often find are the real fear that people have, right? We worry more about the effects that the cyber attack could have socially, economically, military, et cetera, than the actual initial effects of the cyber attack itself. It's sort of the follow-on effects that are often what is more concerning to people. Second is that it's primarily been used by policymakers and officials who have promoted the notion of Cyber Pearl Harbor-like scenarios in public discourse. So when you see Cyber Pearl Harbor showing up in the news media, it's primarily officials who are using that and sort of promoting it with a positive sentiment, meaning Cyber Pearl Harbor is a real thing that could really happen. When people are quoted in media as questioning the idea that this could really happen, it's primarily private actors, either industry, academia, journalists, who are the ones pushing back and saying, yeah, maybe that's not really the threat. Okay, so there's a very clear split between who's using it and who's pushing back on it. But overall, when Cyber Pearl Harbor shows up in the news media, the sentiment in news reports is overwhelmingly positive, meaning not questioning whether or not this is a real thing, whether it could really happen, whether it's the real threat. So when politicians use this kind of rhetoric, or officials or others use this kind of rhetoric in the media, they often get a pass, and the newspaper's like, okay, sure, that's the threat. We've seen more use of Cyber Pearl Harbor over time, but primarily use of this rhetoric in public discourse has spiked on two occasions in the last 25 years that demonstrate the role of appropriation and piggybacking that I mentioned earlier, as well as projection. So in the mid to late 1990s, there was increasing concern with cyber terrorism, and that concern piggybacked off of wider concerns at the time of what was called the new terrorism or the new threats, which were sparked by the World Trade Center attack, the Shinrikyo subway attack, many of you probably remember, and as I already mentioned, the Oklahoma City attack. In fact, one of the pieces that we analyzed was a piece from Foreign Affairs written by none other than John Deutsch, Philip Zelikow, and Ashton Carter in 1998, linking cyber terrorism to those other new threats, and this was despite the fact that the world had yet to actually experience any cyber terrorism. Similarly, in 2011 and 2012, Secretary Panetta's concern, and part of the reason he was warning us about the possibility of a Cyber Pearl Harbor, was in part in response to Iranian reprisals for the US and Israeli Stuxnet attack that had occurred within the context of the larger international tensions over Iran's nuclear program. So Panetta used those attacks to raise the specter of a future possible cyber Pearl Harbor leading to chaos, collapse, paralysis, etc. So despite the fact that we've yet to see any kind of cyber attacks that approach the kinds of impacts imagined in cyber Pearl Harbor in particular, or cyber doom scenarios, more generally, news media is, we found, even less questioning of cyber Pearl Harbor today than in the 1990s. We found that most articles continue to present claims for a possible future cyber Pearl Harbor without questioning how realistic such claims really are. So the continuing use of cyber Pearl Harbor in particular, but cyber doom rhetoric more generally, is interesting because few, if any, serious assessments of the cyber threat that we face actually claim that such doom scenarios are representative of the actual threat. So this might come as a surprise, given how common this kind of rhetoric is. At the 2016 NATO Conflict on Cyber Conflict, Jason Healy of the Atlantic Council and Columbia University said in his keynote, "For 25 years of the last 75 since Pearl Harbor, we've been talking about a digital Pearl Harbor. It still hasn't happened, so we're probably missing the point." He went on to outline what he sees as the real threats of interstate cyber conflict, which he said are a combination of crime, espionage, and information warfare, i.e. precisely what we saw in the 2016 election with Russian cyber interference. But Healy's not alone in making this assessment. In fact, since at least 2008, most serious assessments have rejected cyber doom as the true nature of the cyber threat. So in another study that I did a few years ago, I reviewed the major policy documents, assessments, and speeches, of course open source, right, by Obama administration officials on the nature of the cyber threats facing the United States. What I found was that those assessments, starting with Obama's 60-day cyberspace policy review in May 1998, cited and then echoed the assessment from a CSIS study in 2008, which said, quote, "In the 1990s, we expected damage from cyber attacks to be physical, opened floodgates, crashing airplanes, when it was actually informational." And they went on to say that essentially we expected cyber doom, but what we've come to realize is that the real threat has turned out to be crime, theft of intellectual property, espionage, propaganda, online terrorist recruiting and fundraising activities, etc. That study was quoted in Obama's cyberspace policy review, and the director of Cyber Command, Alexander, at the time, later said that that document served as the blueprint for the Obama administration's thinking about cybersecurity and their policy. And that's reflected. So in September 2015, right, 7 years later, DNI Clapper told Congress 2 times in that same year that the kinds of attacks contemplated in cyber doom rhetoric, right, large-scale, catastrophic infrastructure attacks, do not represent the real cyber threat. The real threat, he said, is more about a death from 1,000 cuts kind of situation relating to longer-term, lower-level attacks against corporate, government, and personal information, like, again, intellectual property theft, ID theft, espionage, and the long-term cumulative effects of these kinds of attacks and situations. He also warned about the growing use of propaganda online and attacks on what he called the integrity of information. So again, it's hard not to see shades of what ultimately has ended up happening in the space of information warfare, fake news, etc. And of course, he listed Russia as one of the top threats all the way back in 2015 in that regard. Nonetheless, during the same period of time, since 2008, we continue seeing the use of doom rhetoric by politicians, officials, experts, journalists, and others. So even though we have these kinds of assessments, we have the Director of National Intelligence going to Congress on 2 occasions and under oath and in writing and saying, cyber Armageddon is not the threat. Look at the Russians, look at propaganda, look at information warfare, integrity, all of these things. People are still beating the cyber doom drum, right? So Richard Clarke, most famously in 2010, warned of cyber attacks that could cripple all U.S. infrastructure, killing thousands of people in just 15 minutes. Amazing what cyber can do. Of course, Leon Panetta's warning about cyber Pearl Harbor was in 2012, when most of the official policy documents and assessments of the administration he was in seemed to actually reject the idea that cyber Pearl Harbor was the threat that we were facing. We've seen various warnings of Cyber 9/11, Cyber Sandy, Cyber Katrina, cyber tsunamis in 2005. I guess that was prior to Obama. But somebody jumped on the tsunami train to be like, if you think the tsunami's bad, which killed what, 250,000 people? I don't know. Think about what a cyber attack could do. I mean, at some point it's offensive, right? It's like the cyber attack is probably not going to kill 250,000 people. The OPM data breach has been called a cyber 9/11. Sony called a cyber Pearl Harbor. Donald Trump's the Deputy National Security Advisor has warned in the past that we are at risk of cyber attacks bigger than 9/11, and she said it's going to be a cyber Pearl Harbor. And then just recently, just a couple weeks ago, Senator Lindsey Graham said he doesn't so much fear another 9/11 as much as he fears a cyber Pearl Harbor. I mentioned a minute ago that I have Google News alerts set up for this stuff, and cyber doom, it happens every day, really. I get hits every single day. In fact, I added some from just the last 24 hours, and after I added those, I got 2 more alerts. So I can't even add them to the slides fast enough. Here's just a sample. There's actually been a spike in cyber doom. I'm getting more alerts in the last couple days. Why? Because of the WannaCry ransomware attack, of course. It's predictable. Whenever something happens, I'm like, okay, the cyber doom thing is my cyber doom meter is going to go off because people are going to use this to warn about cyber Pearl Harbor or some sort of doom scenario, and it always happens. So almost on cue, folks are coming out to use this incident, the WannaCry ransomware, to warn of impending cyber doom or to claim that the WannaCry itself is the fulfillment of cyber Pearl Harbor. So we might actually be living in cyber Pearl Harbor right now. I don't know. But Admiral Stavridis said just yesterday he appropriates the fear and anxiety created by WannaCry to warn that we're not ready for the coming cyber Pearl Harbor. He says that this incident gives us a, quote, pretty good look at what the early stages of a global cyber apocalypse might look like. Can we turn this into a wake-up call? Likewise, Judy Dempsey writes on the Carnegie page that WannaCry is not itself a cyber Pearl Harbor, but that it should be a wake-up call for us. And then from just this morning, Stephen Bryan sees WannaCry as a lesson about the possibility of cyber Pearl Harbor, which he says includes instant meltdown of our government, banking, food supply, military systems, etc. And I always love these kinds of descriptions of cyber war where things happen at the speed of light or at network speed, whatever that means. I don't know what network speed is. Or sometimes instantly. Did you know that things happen instantly online? Because I often have a hard time getting YouTube videos to load, and I sit there watching the little buffer thing. But apparently cyber attacks happen at the speed of light, so that's an interesting thing to learn. Okay, so if we have a lot of serious assessments saying that doom scenarios are not the real threat, why does the use of this kind of rhetoric persist in the U.S. cyber debate, right? So that's one of the things that I've been interested in my research. And so in the book project that I'm working on right now, I argue that it persists for 2 primary reasons. First is that cyber doom rhetoric is, in the different variations that I've talked about, is used primarily as a fear appeal that's meant to call attention and promote a response to the broad range of very real cyber threats that we do face. Its nature as a fear appeal, I argue, is part of why it persists. So various studies from communication to psychology and elsewhere demonstrate that we tend to believe that fear sells, that fear is a good tool for persuasion, that we can scare people into action. So I've put just a couple examples of such studies on the slide here. One is a recent study of attitudes about the use of fear appeals by policymakers, politicians, scientists, advertisers, etc., that shows that even when they know that fear appeals often backfire and often don't work, they still believe that they should use them, right? There's this sort of overwhelming desire to want to use fear to grab people's attention, even in cases where people know it doesn't work. They still can't help themselves, right? Another book-linked study by a scholar of argumentation and rhetoric named Douglas Walton documents the long history of using fear appeals in politics, health promotion campaigns, and many other settings. So if you're interested in this, these are a couple of good places to start, especially Walton's book called Scare Tactics. Of course, just like any other kind of rhetoric, however, not all fear appeals are going to be effective. So I just mentioned, right, oftentimes they actually have a tendency to backfire and not work. So the second reason I believe that the appeal to fear of cyber doom persists is that the particular fears that this rhetoric expresses speak to much more deep-seated cultural and historical fears in our country and our society, namely fears about technology out of control. Technology that we've created that then gets out of our control and turns around and bites us and has negative effects on us. So the idea of technological determinism, right, that technology sort of does its own thing and determines politics, society, and we kind of respond to technology, more so than we're in the driver's seat, has a long history in Western nations, especially in the United States. This often takes a utopian kind of form, right? So the inevitable march of technological advancement that's going to make life better for all of us, right? That's an example of technological determinism of more of an optimistic or utopian kind of bent. Technology's doing its own thing, we're just reaping the rewards, and the future's going to be great. However, there's also a strong pessimistic or dystopian train of technological determinism that a number of prominent historians and philosophers of technology have noted. So I have put some of the best examples on the slide here. A book called Autonomous Technology, Technology Out of Control as a Theme in Political Thought by Langdon Winter. And then a couple of others here by Merritt Roe Smith and Leo Marx. This collection is a great set of essays. And then finally a book called Human-Built World by Tom Hughes. And pretty much anything on the history of technology by Tom Hughes is great stuff. So if you're interested, look into his work. So these fears of technology out of control often revolve around ideas of our dependence on technology and our increased vulnerability because of that, the fragility of societies and individuals when they become dependent on technology, and the worry of what might happen if this technology gets out of control because it's running ahead of law, of policy, of morals, right? I'm sure you've probably all heard examples of this kind of rhetoric before. These fears have manifested time and again in response to new technologies, including electrification, the telegraph, the radio, the telephone, airplanes, tanks, and of course, most recently, computers. And these historians and others demonstrate that these fears have often been misplaced and have resulted in some cases in incorrect problem framings and sometimes even to counterproductive responses to new technologies. So an example, historian David Nye has written an entire book on the history of blackouts. What happens when the power goes out, either through accidental or intentional means. And he argues and shows in his book that we've not typically had panic, chaos, paralysis, collapse that many people often feared, right? Nonetheless, this fear has often led to counterproductive actions causing effects worse than those that policymakers had sought to avoid in the first place. So he gives examples of the use of intentional blackouts during World War II as somewhat of a futile attempt to prevent strategic bombing from happening. It didn't really prevent the bombers from getting through and hitting something, and in many cases, the intentional blackouts may have caused more harm to the society and to the population than not. Additionally, he also gives some interesting statistics that show that in many of the countries during World War II that were subject to strategic bombing, over the course of their war, their electrical generating capacity actually went up, which is something that is sort of counterintuitive from what you would expect. Similarly, Rob McDougall and Susan Douglas have shown that fears of early communication systems were often off the mark. So for example, in the early 20th century, there were widespread fears of the shenanigans that people might get up to over the telegraph or the telephone, including crashing the stock market, engaging in crime, or other illicit activities. While we did, of course, have a crash of the stock market in 1929, it was not the result of the telegraph. In the early 20th century, in fact, there was a series of novels about so-called wire devils. So these were the hackers of their day who got up to all sorts of daring do over the telegraph. And there was a series of like dime novels about it that you can go and read. And oftentimes these technologies, whether it was telephone or telegraph, octopus, like octopi or spiders were often used in public imagery to give like a public, a visual representation of these new technologies, which were sort of reaching out across the entire country and were somewhat menacing, right? in some of my other work in my book on nonlinear science and warfare and in a couple of articles that I've written, have demonstrated that early mechanized warfare theory made use of all sorts of bold predictions about the panic, paralysis, chaos, etc., that tanks and airplanes might wreak on enemy armies and societies. In actuality, the tank did not live up to these initial bold projections. It was obviously a very important weapon, and it led to blitzkrieg and played a huge role in World War II. But the initial promises were that the mere sight of tanks would just cause the enemy to break and run. Just the sound of them would cause this, because people would just be panicked by these giant mechanical beasts coming towards them. And of course, that's not really what happened. Similarly, historians have called into question the effectiveness of strategic bombing of civilian populations during World War II and Vietnam. The tactic did not lead to the panicked and paralyzed citizens calling for immediate surrender that many theorists had projected, and instead, in a lot of cases, it had the opposite effect. This World War II experience, combined with post-war fears of atomic warfare, actually led to the creation of a new subfield in sociology called disaster sociology to study how societies responded to disaster events. And these researchers have demonstrated time and again that the panic, paralysis, and chaos that officials often fear in the wake of natural or man-made disasters rarely appear in real life, that instead people mostly tend to come together in pro-social kinds of behaviors to help one another out and very quickly work to rebuild. So, the real 9/11, the real Katrina, the real Sandy, the real 2003 East Coast blackout, none of these crippled the entire nation or caused the kinds of panic or paralysis often contemplated in the cyber analogs that people put forward. The cyber attacks most often held up as examples or evidence of possible cyber doom certainly fall far from the mark in terms of approximating the kinds of effects seen in strategic bombing, terrorist attacks, or natural disasters. So work by Brandon Valeriano and Ryan Manus has shown convincingly that most cyber attacks are of a low level in nature and do not ultimately end up having a large impact on the overall conflicts of which they're a part. So we see this in the 2007 cyber attack on Estonia, which I mentioned earlier, which did not ultimately prevent the Estonians from moving that Soviet war memorial, which was the cause of Russia's consternation at the time. The immediate impact of the attack was not as severe as initially reported, and in the long term, it served to really just push Estonia closer to NATO, to strengthen their cybersecurity capabilities. And of course, Tallinn is now the home of the Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence for NATO. And the Estonians have ranked much higher, actually, than the United States in the last two NATO locked shield cyber exercises, where in the first one, the US came in dead last and the Estonians were first. The one that just concluded, the US was 12th, I think, and the Estonians were second. I think the Czech Republic was first this time around. Similarly, John Lindsay has a good analysis of Stuxnet, making a strong case that the attack did not achieve its purpose of significantly slowing the Iranian nuclear program in the long term. So now, all of this is not to say that disasters aren't bad or impactful, or that these and other cyber attacks are not important. They certainly are, but they have not lived up to the hypothetical fears that have often accompanied them. But I think it also demonstrates that even though doom seems not to arrive, it hasn't arrived yet, and we've been predicting it for a long time, we still have a historical and sort of ongoing tendency to continue to predict its coming and imagine its effects, no matter the fact that it never seems to get here. And I think cyberdoom is the most recent manifestation of this historical and cultural tendency that we've had going back, all the way to the electric light bulb and the telegraph, and probably even before that as well. Okay, so what are the dangers of this, if any? Does all of this even matter? Isn't it just mere rhetoric? It's just rhetoric, right? Who cares? It's just rhetoric. But I believe that the language we use to speak about the problems we face does matter, and that this is not, or at least should not be, a controversial position to take. So I'll just point to some research on that, right? There's actually a lot of research on the important effects of language on our ability to frame and respond effectively to problems. So I note here, for example, the classic work of Lakoff and Johnson on metaphors, and there are a couple of cognitive scientists, and they argue that metaphors aren't just mere rhetorical tropes or devices, but that our brains actually physically work on the principle of metaphor, of comparing new things to things that we already know and trying to find the best fit between what we think we already know and the world as we encounter it, and then use that to guide our behaviors. And that's essentially what analogies and metaphors are all about. But beyond that, there's a lot more work besides that. And these understandings actually are increasingly shaping U.S. national security discourse more broadly, including cybersecurity discourse. So for example, the U.S. Army and Marine Corps have adopted design thinking in their official doctrine, which places a great deal of importance on issues of framing, language, metaphor, analogy, and rhetoric even. So it's kind of interesting to think about tough guys in green suits or khaki suits who are really concerned about their use of metaphors and what that might do to them. But that is going on right now. And another study that I'm working on with one of my graduate students, we're looking at Army field manuals and articles from the professional journals, et cetera, and looking at the way they've talked about design and the role of language, and they're thinking about why language is so important. The U.S. Strategic Command, which is the parent organization of U.S. Cyber Command, has identified improper language as a key challenge to cybersecurity strategy making. And U.S. Cyber Command has actually commissioned work to help it come up with better analogies, metaphors, and parables for thinking about cyber conflict. In fact, that work was done just down the road here at the Naval Postgraduate School. John Arquilla was part of that. So what are some possible negative implications of this ongoing use of cyber doom rhetoric then? If language really is important, it shapes the way we think, the way we act, and the way we understand the world around us, what are some of the negative implications potentially? So I think the first thing is that cyber doom rhetoric leads us towards a number of cognitive biases. Right? So the first of those is probability neglect, or what's sometimes called possibilistic thinking. So this is focusing on what's possible or sometimes merely imaginable, and potentially then ignoring or discounting what's actually probable to happen or what is actually already happening. So in some respects, this way of thinking substitutes imagination for evidence. We focus on the most frightening scenarios that we can imagine, but which are not as probable, and instead maybe focus less on things that are really going on but aren't quite as fearful and we don't think are going to elicit as much of a response from whatever audience it is we're trying to motivate and inspire to listen to us, right? The next is availability bias, right? So this is the idea of sometimes we're biased towards whatever we saw most recently or whatever we can recall most easily. We think that that is what's really going on. But it might not be, right? It might just be that it's the last thing you saw on TV. And so one concern that I have is that the constant repetition of cyber doom, whether it's by officials or in the media or some combination, might artificially increase our sense that this is the real threat or that it is actually already occurring, causing us to miscalculate how salient such scenarios really are to the threats that we actually face, right? It's that old idea of repetition in propaganda, right? If you repeat something often enough, people will come to believe it. That's sort of a concern that I have here, right? That people will come to think that this is really real because they just keep hearing it over and over again, right? And I've already mentioned the last two here, projection, mirror imaging, and deterministic thinking. These in and of themselves are actually cognitive biases. As I mentioned earlier, they can lead us to threats or lead us to see threats where none potentially exist, or to discount our own responsibility and agency over the decisions that we make and actions that we take, and can potentially lead to self-fulfilling prophecies, right? So if technology's, it's doing its own thing out there, it's inevitable that whatever situation is going to happen, then you're suddenly not really responsible anymore, right, for the actions that you took that actually made it inevitable. But if you recognize your own agency and your own responsibility in the world, then you realize maybe the inevitable things weren't really that inevitable if I pay attention to the role that my own actions played in them. And indeed, I think we've seen some evidence of these kinds of outcomes already. If we really think that the threat is catastrophic attack, then we're more likely to focus on military solutions, right? If we really think it's catastrophic attack, and it really is, then yeah, it makes sense that the military is who we would want to protect us. What's more, we might be more likely to develop and then use our own capabilities to inflict this kind of damage that we fear in cyber scenarios thereby encouraging others to do the same thing, aka the security dilemma, which I'm sure you've all heard of, or also sometimes called a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so this is one of my concerns about Stuxnet as an example. Existing research on the use of fear appeal arguments indicates, as I mentioned earlier, that though they are very tempting for gaining attention and motivating people to action, they actually very often backfire and don't achieve their purpose. So John Hamre, who was actually one of the first people to use the Cyber Pearl Harbor analogy in the 1990s, worried all these years later in 2015 that perhaps the analogy backfired, right? Perhaps it didn't actually mobilize national awareness, and part of the reason he gave was, well, if you say Cyber Pearl Harbor and people really take that seriously, then they think, oh, okay, well then the military is going to solve it. I don't need to do anything. And so it kind of backfired in terms of getting broad-based mobilization. Work that I presented at the 2016 NATO Conference on Cyber Conflict demonstrated this effect in audience responses to depictions of a catastrophic cyber doom scenario on television. So using insights from quantitative studies of fear appeal effectiveness in health communication, my co-authors and I examined an audience's responses to the American Blackout docudrama that aired on the National Geographic Channel. I don't know if anybody has seen that. It's a little bit of a riot to watch. The results showed that many people didn't take this scenario seriously at all. They just kind of made fun of it, meaning that if this show was meant in some way to get their attention and motivate them to do something, it was an abysmal failure. But among the people who did express that they thought this seemed realistic and they sort of bought the argument that this scenario was selling, those people were also much more likely to express a sense of fatalism about the ability to do anything to prevent it or to cope with it. And this tracks along with what fear appeal research has shown time and again. Oftentimes, it just backfires or it just doesn't work at all. And in some cases, when it does work, it doesn't elicit the response that you were wanting to get, right? So if you show people, for example, lots of scary images of what can happen if you smoke, you get cancer, you can get cancer, and look at all these horrible images of what can happen to you, some people will have the opposite response. In fact, a significant number of people will sometimes have the opposite response and say, well, I've been smoking for 20 years. I guess there's nothing I can do about it now. I'm probably going to get cancer anyway. Light up another one. Okay? And that's sort of what we saw in some folks' response to this particular television show. So, I share James Lewis of the CSIS, his concern that the use of fear in the form of cyber doom rhetoric can simultaneously then encourage militarized overreactions combined with an underreaction on the part of those who are the real targets and victims of cyber threats, civilian agencies, private corporations, and in some cases even individuals. That is, I worry that we may focus on hypothetical doom scenarios, thinking that it's the military's job to save us, while underreacting to or ignoring the more mundane threats from crime and espionage that are costly daily occurrences that the military is ultimately ill-equipped to prevent or respond to. Various experts have seen a focus on cyber doom-like scenarios like Cyber Pearl Harbor as implicated, in fact, in our inability to see the Russian cyber interference in the 2016 presidential election coming. So in December of 2016, both James Lewis and Joseph Nye had articles that sort of made this point, saying, Joseph Nye said it's probably ultimately, pretty easy to deter actors from taking physical attack against us. We've probably exaggerated this whole Cyber Pearl Harbor thing, but how do you deter actors from doing the kind of thing that Russia did during the election? And James Lewis makes the same point, I think, even more pointedly, and saying, Panetta, the Department of Defense, others were focused on, okay, when's the Pearl Harbor going to happen? And then the Russians, with the help of WikiLeaks and whoever else, snuck in the back door and did all the shenanigans that they did during the election. And, we're still feeling the effects of that today. In fact, I just wondered to myself, what national scandal has happened in the last hour since I've been standing up here? I don't know. I need to go and check and see, right? Most important, however, is the possibility of being distracted by more dangerous non-cyber threats. And I think this has actually already occurred. So in 1994, futurist Alvin Toffler raised the possibility that the next attack on the World Trade Center might be a cyber attack. He said they won't need to blow up the World Trade Center. Instead, they'll feed signals in from computers in Libya or Tehran or Pyongyang and shut down the whole banking system if they want to. He was not alone. Many in the national security community were awaiting the long-predicted cyber Pearl Harbor-like scenario and were surprised when it didn't materialize, right? In the wake of 9/11, Marcus Sachs, who was on the President's Critical Infrastructure Protection Board, said, quote, "Based on what we knew at the time, the most likely scenario was an attack from cyberspace, not airliners slamming into buildings. We had spent a lot of time preparing for a cyber attack, not a physical attack. Our priorities had to change a little bit." Even though those who have questioned cyber doom scenarios and cyber Pearl Harbor have not been immune to this sort of tendency. So during his June 25th, 1996 testimony, the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, John Deutsch, said that cyber threats outrank terrorism. They're the biggest threat just behind weapons of mass destruction attacks for the United States. Later, that very same day that he gave that testimony, was the al-Qaeda truck bomb against the Khobar Towers in Saudi Arabia, which, of course, was not a cyber attack, right? Similarly, DNI Clapper, even though he sort of rejected, right, cyber Armageddon, continued up until he was not DNI anymore, to rank cyber above terrorism as the top threat to the United States, right? Even as we continue to experience ISIS attacks, killing people in the United States and abroad, and we're sucked into a conflict against ISIS in Syria, and a cyber attack has yet to kill anybody, okay? Indeed, ISIS terrorist attacks have served as precisely the kind of focusing event mentioned earlier that can focus attention on cyber threats, even if the focusing event itself was not a cyber attack. So, for example, as I wrote in a piece for Forbes a couple of years ago, the Paris terrorist attacks, which were not cyber attacks, led to a spike in media discussion of possible ISIS cyber attacks. Oh my gosh, they just did this attack in Paris. But what if they did a cyber attack? Let's worry about that, right? And it wasn't just the media. Officials also jumped on this event and used the occasion of the Paris attacks to promote all sorts of cybersecurity-related initiatives, using Paris as evidence for why such measures were supposedly necessary. So part of what I did was basically did a sort of a content analysis of news media articles about cyber and the primary threat subjects that we typically think of when we think of cyber: China, North Korea, Iran, terrorists, ISIS, etc. Before and after the Paris attacks, and you see a massive jump in the number of articles that are identifying ISIS as a possible cyber attacker in the immediate wake of the Paris attacks, when prior to that, the main subject that most articles were talking about is we need to be worried about China. Okay? So just overnight, because of the Paris attacks, suddenly people worried about ISIS cyber attacks, even though that terrorist attack was not a cyber attack in any way. So it's another example of sort of using events to sort of push people's attention towards cyber, even when those events themselves are not cyber. Okay, so last slide, last two slides, I guess. Some alternatives. Ultimately, I think we need to explore alternatives for thinking and speaking about cybersecurity threats. Intentionally or not, the analogies and metaphors we use to talk about these problems, I think, do have an impact and can be detrimental. So what are some of those alternatives? Oh, I changed it on mine and not this. Okay. As mentioned earlier, we can have a tendency to conflate many different kinds of problems into one monolithic problem or threat. So I think the first step is to disaggregate the various kinds of cyber problems that we face. Crime, espionage, propaganda, fundraising, recruitment by terrorists, and critical infrastructure are not all the same problems. There's a lot of differences. But where there are commonalities, of course, I think we should pursue solutions that work at the intersections of those, but I don't think we should start with the idea of one monolithic threat that can have a sort of one-size-fits-all solution. Instead of thinking in terms of a new cyber Cold War, perhaps we need to have other warfare models as a way of thinking. So perhaps guerrilla warfare or political warfare, insurgency, or hybrid warfare models are more appropriate ways of thinking about cyber conflict, especially considering that so many of the actors and incidents that we see in cyber conflict are non-state. Even if states are involved, they often work through non-state actors, right? Even in the case of, if we think about Russia and what just happened with the election, whether it's media companies or WikiLeaks or trolls on Twitter or whatever, a lot of the foot soldiers are non-state actors. But of course, even during the Cold War, much of the conflict took place at a lower level than all-out confrontation between the superpowers. So even if we used the Cold War as a model for thinking about cyber threats, I think we need to go back and revisit our history books, because I think it was about, in a lot of cases, something other than what we're attempting to apply to our thinking about cyber conflict. Instead of nuclear weapons in warfare, which is another one of these analogies that comes out of the broader tendency to want to use the Cold War as a way of thinking about cyber, I think maybe if we're going to think about weapons to use as analogies to think about cyber, maybe chemical or biological weapons and warfare are more appropriate, right? To me, cyber conflict recalls the difficulty in controlling the use, the proliferation of these inherently dual-use technologies. So that might be a model that we can use to think. Instead of prioritizing the development of offensive military capabilities or even military responses, perhaps a public health kind of way of thinking or a public health model for thinking about prevention and mitigation could be more appropriate, right? Maybe we should think in terms of promoting cyber hygiene or cyber herd immunity or something like this to make us more resilient in the long term, to help mitigate the effects of attacks if they do occur, and hopefully up the cost for a would-be attacker, right? They're not going to get the effect that they want to have if they attack us because we've made ourselves resilient, so maybe that could decrease the possibility of them attacking in the first place. And finally, instead of focusing on government-led responses, I think we need to think more about possible private sector responses, market responses, perhaps crafting liability laws in a way that promote the creation of robust insurance markets, or to promote other kind of cybersecurity measures among private actors who ultimately will be the first responders. Just like in biowarfare, part of what we did is we went out and we trained firefighters and doctors and nurses and ER crews, et cetera, because we realized if this does happen, the military can't respond to it. Ultimately, it's going to be the people who are on the scene who are the first responders. And I think there's a similar argument that could be made here. So with that, I will open it up to questions and discussion. Thank you very much.